October 17th, 1943. Camp Aliceville, Alabama. The night was black and still when a German prisoner, trembling from exhaustion, lifted a tin mess kit to his lips. Inside it was scrambled eggs steaming with butter, thick slices of white bread, a slab of bacon, and real coffee laced with sugar and cream. He hadn't tasted food like this in years, not since before the war. His body weighed barely 128 pounds, a frame starved into a walking skeleton by endless campaigns across North Africa, where sawdust bread and mule meat had been his only sustenance. As he took the first bite, tears cut down the dirt of his face. It wasn't just hunger that broke him. It was the realization that the enemy he had been taught to despise was feeding him better than his own homeland ever had. In that moment, something deeper than nourishment occurred. His diary would later confess the unimaginable. That captivity in America was not punishment, but salvation. After 2 years as a prisoner, he wrote, he had gained nearly 60 pounds. His cheeks filled, his eyes nearly hidden in flesh, his hollow body transformed into a man unrecognizable to those who had watched him waste away in Hitler's desert war. His testimony was not unique. Across the United States, from Texas to Kansas, from Georgia to Arizona, German prisoners of war were experiencing the same metamorphosis. They arrived skeletal, malnourished, half dead from campaigns that had drained them of strength. They departed heavier, healthier, and often, confoundingly, thankful. It was one of the great ironies of the Second World War. While German civilians back home lined up for turnip rations, while Wehrmacht soldiers on the Eastern Front gnawed frozen horse meat just to survive, their captured comrades in America were consuming 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day. They ate steak, fresh bread, fruit, butter, and drank coffee so rich it made their starving stomachs convulse at first. The very men who had marched under the swastika became living monuments to American plenty. By the war's end, more than 425,000 Germans had been held in American prison camps. Thousands returned home heavier by 40, 50, even 60 pounds. Their transformed bodies carried a hidden message more powerful than any weapon fired in battle. That democracy had not only defeated them on the battlefield, it had overfed them into a new understanding of what true power really meant. When the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943, the US Army Medical Corps was confronted with an army in collapse. Men who had once been paraded as Hitler's desert elite shuffled into captivity with protruding ribs and yellowed eyes. Medical officers documented malnutrition on a scale that shocked even hardened physicians. Scurvy etched itself into gums that bled with every bite. Night blindness left soldiers stumbling in the dark, and swollen legs betrayed bodies devouring themselves from protein starvation. Their uniforms hung off them like rags on scarecrows, leather belts cinched twice over just to keep trousers from sliding off wasted hips. The official German field ration, the Verpflegungssatz, promised 4,000 calories for combat troops. But by late 1942, the promise was a fantasy. Supply lines snapped under the strain of Allied blockade and desert logistics. Soldiers subsisted on ersatz rations, coffee brewed from burnt acorns sweetened with saccharin, dried vegetables that swelled in the stomach but delivered almost no nourishment, tinned horse meat padded with sawdust filler. Bread, when available, was often riddled with weevils. One soldier later described it not as sustenance, but as punishment, food that reminded you of what hunger felt like even as you chewed it. Then came the capture. Processing centers in North Africa and Italy funneled thousands of these skeletal men into the holds of Liberty ships. For many, the crossing to America was the first step back toward life. The shock was immediate. On board, they were served beef stew with potatoes, thick slices of bread slathered in butter, and coffee mixed with milk. It was a meal greater in calories than they had received in an entire week of desert war. Many vomited, their shrunken stomachs rejecting the sudden richness. Yet even this painful reaction revealed the depth of starvation they had endured. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Matthews, one of the American officers supervising embarkations, described watching prisoners struggle to climb the gangplanks. He said they looked like walking cadavers, some so weak that they had to be carried aboard. But within days, with carefully measured feedings, they began to revive. Hollow cheeks filled, their eyes brightened, their bodies ravaged by years of deprivation, began the long journey back toward health under the watch of enemy hands. For the Germans, captivity in America began not with barbed wire, but with bread, warm, plentiful, and unlike anything they had known in years of total war. The abundance was not accidental, it was mandated. The 1929 Geneva Convention's Article 11 stated with clinical precision that prisoners of war must be fed rations equal in quantity and quality to those of the captor's own depot troops. For the United States, this was not only compliance with international law, it became a strategic doctrine. Colonel Edward Davidson of the Provost Marshal General's Office put it bluntly in a 1943 memo. Every well-fed German prisoner is potential insurance for American prisoners in German hands. Food became a weapon of reciprocity, a safeguard against reprisals, and a statement of strength. The scale of the operation was staggering. By 1944, more than 425,000 German POWs were housed in nearly every corner of the United States. From pine forests in Alabama to the plains of Kansas and the deserts of Arizona, entire compounds were constructed with barracks, mess halls, and industrial kitchens designed to feed thousands 3 times a day. Camp quartermasters became generals of logistics. They requisitioned tons of meat, dairy, grains, and fresh produce. They coordinated with local suppliers and regional depots. They maintained refrigerated warehouses, bakeries, and even walk-in freezers, ensuring nothing spoiled before it reached the tin trays of their prisoners. Inspections were relentless. Swiss delegates toured camps, Red Cross officials monitored menus, and paperwork stacked by the ton tracked caloric intake, menu rotations, and medical examinations. The American bureaucracy, vast and meticulous, ensured that the letter of the Geneva Convention was followed not just in spirit, but in calorie counts, weighed portions, and documented results. For the prisoners, the garrison ration meant something extraordinary: 3,000 to 4,000 calories daily. Meals included bread, butter, milk, cheese, potatoes, meat, and vegetables. Coffee flowed in endless pots, real coffee, not the acorn-brewed substitute they had endured in Germany. On top of this, commissaries allowed them to purchase cigarettes, chocolate, ice cream, beer, and even soft drinks using camp scrip earned through labour. Some ate as much as 5,000 calories a day, consuming more in captivity than they had ever known in freedom. The irony was sharp. Outside camp fences, American civilians struggled with rationing. Families stood in lines for butter and sugar, clipped coupons for meat, and stretched coffee grounds to last a week. Yet the enemy, uniformed men who had once marched behind swastikas, ate steak twice weekly, drank fresh milk daily, and gained weight under American guard. The human body does not lie. And within weeks of arrival, the German prisoners of war began to reveal a truth that no ideology could conceal. Hunger had been their silent executioner, and food was now their resurrection. Medical officers weighed the men upon intake. One report from Camp Swift, Texas, noted average body weights hovering at 125 to 135 pounds for soldiers who should have weighed 160 or more. Teeth were rotted from vitamin deficiencies, gums swollen and bleeding. Some men carried the telltale signs of beriberi, legs puffy with fluid, nerves misfiring from lack of thiamine. Others showed the sunken eyes and skeletal frames of long-term caloric deprivation. But then the feeding began. 3 hot meals a day, plus milk, bread, fruit, and coffee. Doctors documented weight gains at a speed that astonished them. Within 3 months, average prisoners gained 20 to 25 pounds. After a year, many added 40 or more. One officer described his charges as nearly unrecognizable compared to their emaciated intake photographs. Men who had shuffled into captivity dragging their boots were soon filling out uniforms, laughing in mess halls, and working in fields with restored vigour. By 1945, Red Cross inspectors noted that many German POWs in the United States were physically healthier than the average American civilian. They consumed more protein, more dairy, more fresh produce. Ironic in a nation still under ration books and meatless Tuesdays. Newspapers occasionally hinted at the paradox, publishing quiet grumbles from American families who felt the enemy was eating better than their own children. The War Department carefully managed these optics, downplaying the caloric richness of POW diets while ensuring compliance with Geneva Convention obligations. But the prisoners themselves were not oblivious. In camp diaries they wrote with disbelief. One man from Württemberg confessed, "I eat more here as a prisoner than my family does in Germany as free people." Another scrawled in his journal, "My mother would not recognize me. I am fat. My cheeks are round. I feel alive again." Food did more than heal bodies. It unsettled minds. For men raised under the rigid propaganda of Hitler's Reich, the bounty of American captivity gnawed at their worldview. They had been taught that democracy was weak, decadent, corrupt. Yet here they were, in the heart of that democracy, nourished, restored, even fattened by its abundance. And in this contradiction, the seeds of doubt began to grow. At first, the German prisoners tried to explain it away. Some muttered that the Americans were fattening them like pigs before slaughter. Others insisted it was all for show, that behind the mess halls there must be starvation, bread lines, or hidden misery. Nazi propaganda had drilled it into their skulls. America was a collapsing nation of mongrels, ruled by greedy capitalists incapable of sacrifice. The Reich's radio had painted the United States as a land of crime, poverty, and chaos. But day after day, the food kept coming. Piles of potatoes, steaks sizzling on iron skillets, milk cold from iceboxes, fruit so fresh its sweetness shocked their tongues. The contradictions mounted until denial itself collapsed. The men could no longer reconcile what they were told with what they now lived. In camp journals, one finds entries that read like confessions. A soldier from Hamburg wrote, "They told us Americans were soft, yet here I see discipline, organization, and above all, abundance. This is not weakness. This is power." Another, once a loyal member of the Hitler Youth, admitted that for the first time he wondered whether Germany had been lied to from the start. The camp environment magnified this effect. Life behind barbed wire was controlled but not cruel. Guards often treated prisoners with professionalism, sometimes even with kindness. Many Americans were farm boys themselves, barely older than the Germans they guarded. The sight of enemy and captor laughing over cigarettes or trading jokes shattered the carefully built image of the inhuman Yankee. Psychologists in the U.S. Army's Special Projects Division recognized the opportunity. They observed how comfort, food, and fair treatment softened resistance and cracked ideology. Leaflets, films, and discussion groups were quietly introduced. Political re-education was subtle, never forced, but always present. The abundance of food, the very excess that filled stomachs, became the silent partner in this campaign. It spoke without words. Democracy feeds, fascism starves. The mental toll was not immediate but cumulative. A man who gains 40 pounds in captivity cannot deny the reality of his transformation. He feels it in his stronger legs, in the fullness of his cheeks, in the ease of his breath. And he compares it, always compares it, to the gnawing hunger letters from home described. For many, the conclusion was unavoidable. The Reich had promised glory but delivered famine. America, their sworn enemy, had given them bread, and with it, doubt. The letters from home arrived in trembling handwriting, carried across oceans by censors and military post. They told of empty shelves, of coal stoves without fuel, of children who cried themselves to sleep from hunger. Mothers described mixing turnip flour with sawdust to stretch bread, boiling nettles for soup, trading wedding rings for a sack of potatoes. Even officers' families in Berlin scavenged for scraps in markets where prices climbed by the day. By 1944, German civilians were surviving on little more than 1,000 calories daily, barely enough to sustain life. Prisoners in America read these letters as they sat in camp canteens, sipping coffee with cream and eating pies baked fresh from local farms. The contradiction was unbearable. One prisoner from Bavaria wrote in his diary, "I eat meat 3 times a week here. My wife writes that she has not tasted it in months. I do not know how to answer her letters." Another confessed shame at his growing body. "I am gaining weight while my children grow thinner. I feel like a traitor, yet I cannot stop eating." The guilt mingled with astonishment. Camp reports note that some men hoarded food, sneaking bread rolls into pockets to mail home in parcels, desperate attempts to share their fortune. Others sent back soap, chocolate, or canned goods purchased at camp stores with their work wages. The parcels were small gestures, but they carried a devastating symbolism. The prisoners of war were better supplied than their free families in the Reich. German propaganda could not explain this away. Goebbels thundered about American decadence, but the evidence sat in every prisoner's swollen belly. At home, children scavenged in bombed ruins for firewood. In America, their fathers drank cold milk from tall glasses under the guard of men who were supposed to hate them. The irony grew sharper as the war dragged on. German soldiers, on the Eastern Front, starved to death in snow-filled trenches, eating bark and boiled leather. In the Ardennes, rations were reduced to scraps of bread and thin soup. Meanwhile, behind American fences, those same soldiers' captured comrades were eating more than any Wehrmacht field kitchen had ever dreamed of providing. Every bite in captivity became a reminder of the Reich's failure. Hunger followed the German people wherever the swastika flew. Only in enemy hands did these men find abundance, and the shame of that truth was a wound deeper than captivity itself. Beyond the barbed wire, resentment simmered. American families lived with ration books tucked in kitchen drawers, their pages stamped and marked like lifelines. Sugar, butter, meat, gasoline, every purchase was counted, every indulgence rationed for the war effort. Housewives stretched meals with powdered eggs and margarine dyed yellow to mimic butter. Children chewed gum made from resin substitutes. Even coffee, the morning ritual, came in scarce tins carefully measured spoon by spoon. And yet, just miles away, German prisoners of war were dining on hearty rations that sometimes exceeded what the average American family could afford. Local newspapers occasionally published reports. German soldiers served steak, German soldiers drinking milk every day. The reaction was instant and bitter. Letters poured into the War Department demanding to know why enemies of the United States were eating better than its citizens. One Ohio mother wrote angrily, "My boy fights in Italy with less than the Huns receive in Kansas. Why must my family sacrifice while theirs grow fat?" Officials scrambled to contain the outrage. War Department press releases downplayed the menus, emphasizing the Geneva Convention and reciprocity for American POWs in German hands. But the reality could not be hidden. In some towns, civilian employees who worked inside camps whispered about the prisoners' meals: thick bacon, fried chicken, potatoes with gravy, fresh fruit desserts. The gossip spread into resentment. At Camp Aliceville in Alabama, local farmers who sold produce to the camp watched their own children drink watered-down milk, while their former enemies received it cold and whole by the pint. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, a Red Cross inspector's report noted that German POWs had gained an average of 26 pounds within a year, information that never reached the newspapers but was quietly known among those who worked the kitchens. The paradox cut deep. Democracy demanded fairness, but survival demanded sacrifice. To some Americans, feeding German prisoners lavishly was an insult to the families scraping by on ration stamps. But to others, especially those with sons held captive in Europe, It was a grim necessity. "If we starve their boys," one Iowa father said, "what chance has mine in their camps?" Still, the unease never disappeared. Every steak served to a German prisoner felt like a stolen meal from an American table. And yet the policy held firm, a calculated gamble that abundance would win more than resentment could ever lose. The barbed wire separated them, but food and labor slowly began to blur the lines. Across America, German prisoners were put to work in fields, factories, and lumber mills, earning small wages in camp scrip redeemable at canteens. Farmers who had lost sons and hired hands to the front now found themselves depending on the very men their boys were fighting overseas. In Texas cotton fields, Kansas wheat farms, and Minnesota orchards, the sight became familiar. German POWs bent over rows of crops, sweat soaking their khaki uniforms marked with PW. At first, local families eyed them with suspicion. Mothers warned children not to wander too close. But as weeks turned into months, something remarkable happened. Work turned strangers into something more familiar. Farm wives brought water jugs filled with lemonade to the edges of fields. Farmers shared sandwiches at midday breaks. Some POWs, polite and eager to prove their usefulness, helped repair fences, fix tractors, even play with children. And when harvests were heavy, they were invited to share meals, simple American fare of cornbread, beans, pies, and roasted meats. For many prisoners, these farmhouse tables carried a shock greater than the camp mess halls. They discovered not only abundance but hospitality, given freely by people who had lost so much to their war. Stories abound of bonds formed in these strange circumstances. In Iowa, a POW wrote in his diary, "I sat at the table of an American family tonight. They treated me as a guest, not an enemy. I could not eat for the lump in my throat." In Wisconsin, children learned German songs from prisoners who taught them in exchange for English words. Some men left sketches, handmade toys, or carpentry gifts for the families they worked beside. Food became the universal bridge. Sharing bread broke propaganda's hold faster than any leaflet. One farmer later recalled, "I looked across the table and thought, this boy could have been my son. The only difference was the uniform." By war's end, thousands of German POWs had carried home not just extra weight on their bodies, but memories of American kitchens, American fields, and the bewildering kindness of strangers. For many, it was the first crack in the wall of hate they had been raised within. Behind every bite, there was an unspoken truth. The enemy was human, and abundance had revealed it. By 1946, the barbed wire came down. Trains and ships carried the German prisoners back across the Atlantic, their uniforms exchanged for patched civilian clothes. But they did not return as they had arrived. They went home heavier, healthier, and haunted by the contradiction they had lived inside America. The contrast was devastating. When they stepped off the trains in Frankfurt, Munich, or Hamburg, they found cities reduced to rubble. Streets once lined with bakeries now smelled only of ash and rot. Black markets thrived, but legal rations for civilians were meagre, sometimes less than 1,000 calories per day. Bread was grey and thin, meat nearly non-existent, milk reserved for infants. Malnutrition crippled entire families. Children's bellies swelled from hunger, the elderly withered in silence. And into this ruin walked men who looked almost prosperous, their cheeks round, their bodies thickened by months or years of American rations. Some were unrecognizable to their own families. Letters and diaries described the shame. A returned POW wrote, "My wife is a shadow. My daughter's legs are sticks. Yet I have gained 40 pounds in America. She looks at me as if I had betrayed her." The bitterness was real. Neighbours sometimes resented the returning prisoners, calling them butter-fed or mocking them as men who had grown fat while others starved. But beneath the resentment lay something else, curiosity. These men carried stories of America, not propaganda, not rumour, but first-hand experience. They spoke of milk flowing freely, of bread without sawdust, of markets where food was so abundant it seemed endless. They described camp meals that outshone even Germany's pre-war abundance. For many, these accounts planted a dangerous thought. Perhaps everything the Reich had taught them about the enemy was a lie. Some former prisoners became living proof that democracy had not only defeated fascism on the battlefield, but outperformed it at the dinner table. Abundance itself became political testimony. The Allies understood this. Quietly, American officials encouraged POWs to carry their impressions home, hoping they would act as seeds for a different Germany. And in many cases, it worked. Prisoners who had once marched behind swastikas returned as skeptics, even admirers of the strange, powerful nation that had fed them in captivity. The irony was searing. They had gone to war to conquer. Instead, they returned conquered not only by arms, but by bread, by butter, by the simple, overwhelming power of food. History remembers tanks, planes, and bombs. It remembers the iron thunder of armies and the cities burned to ash. But for the German prisoners of war in America, the most unforgettable weapon was far quieter. It came not with fire, but with warmth. Not with terror, but with nourishment. It was bread. It was butter. It was a plate set before a starving man by the very enemy he had sworn to destroy. When they looked back, many admitted the truth that haunted them more than defeat itself. They had been broken not by barbed wire or rifles, but by abundance. Their bodies betrayed them. Cheeks filled, bellies swelled, muscles returned. They grew heavier in captivity while their own families wasted away at home. And in that physical transformation lay a psychological one. A recognition that the Reich had lied, that democracy was not weakness, but strength so vast it could feed even its enemies. Decades later, interviews with surviving POWs carried the same refrain. I learned what freedom meant in America. Some spoke with gratitude, some with shame, but nearly all admitted that the experience had left an indelible mark. For many, the first seeds of post-war reconciliation between Germany and the United States were planted not in treaties or speeches, but in camp kitchens where potatoes boiled and bread baked in endless supply. The paradox of war is cruel. Civilians in Germany starved while their captured soldiers feasted. American mothers rationed sugar while Nazi soldiers ate pie behind fences. It was unjust, bitter, and controversial, but it was also deliberate. Food was not just sustenance, it was strategy, morality, and message. It whispered across every plate, "This is what your leaders denied you. This is what your enemy can give." And so, when the war ended, the Germans who had lived this contradiction carried it home. They stepped into the ruins of their nation car, wrying memories of abundance so vast that it seemed like myth. They had lost the war, but in that loss they had glimpsed a truth their own country had never shown them, that the greatest weapon America wielded was not its bombs or bullets, but its ability to feed the world, even those who had once sworn to destroy it. The War of Bread was never written in battle reports. Yet for thousands of German prisoners, it was the war they never forgot.